It is certainly a pleasure to be here in your beautiful city and county this evening. What I want to do is impart to you some thoughts about the Colorado River tonight, and particularly about its future. I didn't grow up in the West. I grew up in Missouri, where it rains and it's lots of water all the time, but I fell in love with the Colorado River the first time I ever saw it, hiking in the Grand Canyon. I've been on the river working on it 23 years. It's a relatively short period of time, quite frankly. It's a fascinating river system. It's beautiful, of course. It means a lot to all of us, and it's fairly complicated, quite frankly. So my goal tonight is to break through some of that complication and give you some insights into it. To accomplish that, I'm going to talk a little bit about the background. How many of you here have heard of a term called the law of the river? Yeah, most everybody, exactly. Good. We'll talk a little bit about that. I want to focus also on how we operate the two largest reservoirs on this system, Lake Powell and Lake Mead. Together they combine and give us about 83% of our total storage capacity on the river system, so they're very important to us. Talk a little bit about the current state of the system, and then focus about our future. Let me start with just the Basin Map. As most of you know, over 90% of the water in this basin originates in about 15% of the watershed. That's an amazing set of numbers, really, and it's a snow melt-driven system. I think we all know that. Now, rain is important to us. Precipitation, other than snow, completes the water year as we tend to think of it. So rain is important, but it is primarily snow in the Rocky Mountains that drives this system. Down here in the lower basin, less than 10% of the water is generated there, and quite a bit of that, over half of it, is over here in the Gila River Basin in Arizona. Given development that's in the Gila River Basin today, very little of that water ever reaches the main stem. In fact, about once out of every 10 years does water flow out of the Gila River Basin and arrive at Yuma, Arizona. As Michael mentioned, 7 states rely on this river system. And those 7 states and the federal government work very diligently to cooperate and make sure this system does meet all of our needs, and the needs of not just us human beings, but also environmentally. With that said, as you probably most all know, much of this river is used outside the boundaries of the basin. We're sitting, as Michael pointed out, in an area that transfers the water, delivers the water outside of the basin over to the users here in San Diego. Similarly in Denver, Albuquerque, New Mexico. You probably know that. There is a diversion that moves water out of the San Juan drainage over to Albuquerque. So lots of people and lots of cities rely on the river system. Well, let's talk a little bit about the governance. So the law of the river. It is complicated. I'm a student of it, and I really do mean that. It's a lifelong chore. It's that way because it is complicated, but it also is evolving. It's not static. Many people really hear the law of the river and they think, oh, that's just old stuff we put in place and we never looked at it again. And it's absolutely not that. It began in the compact, and that's what this picture is the 7 states led by the feds came together in Santa Fe. And they came together to divide the river. And they were going to divide it up so each state got a share. They were not able to do that. They were able, though, to divide it into 2 basins. And they did that, an upper basin, as you've heard, and a lower basin. And they allocated a certain amount of water to each basin. Happens to be 7.5 million acre feet. I think most all of you know an acre foot is a volume measurement, an acre of land a foot deep in water. Well, that was a major accomplishment, to divide it up, at least by basins. They also knew that we had to share the water between the basins. So there was a requirement put in this 1922 compact that the upper basin states couldn't deplete the flow in the river below some threshold value, at a dividing point, and that point again between the basins is called Lee Ferry. It is not the current gauge location, Lee's Ferry, so has some of the complexity already, just in terms of names. But there is this requirement that the upper basin states must make sure that the flow doesn't go below 75 million acre feet in every consecutive 10-year period. Now, it's not quite that easy because also everyone knew Mexico was going to demand and was already demanding a share of the river. We had to figure out what to do with that. So that depletion requirement also says that each basin will split whatever the need of Mexico is that the river can't meet. We don't have a number for it. This is a bone of contention. It has been on this river system forever, and it's been set aside. We've all agreed to set it aside at least for some period of time because it'll be a tough one to resolve. Now, meanwhile, the lower basin states were anxious to develop, and so we passed a law, Congress passed a law that it authorized us to build Hoover Dam, and it divided the lower basin into 3 actual values. California got 4.4 million acre feet, Arizona 2.8, and Nevada 0.3. I happen to live in Boulder City, Nevada. There wasn't much there. Boulder City, if you've never been there, or if you have, you may not know this, it was a government camp. It was there and owned by the government through 1959, every house, because we were there just to build a dam and to operate that dam. On we went in time, and Mexico showed up. We had a treaty in 1944, and they were allocated 1.5 million acre feet. So if you're kind of keeping track so far, that's 9 million acre feet of water that's allocated below Lee Ferry, plus another 7.5 above. And finally, the upper basin states in the late 40s got together, and honestly, they knew a little more than we knew in the lower basin, perhaps in 1929, and that was, hey, we don't really know what the flows in this river are. Let's allocate by percentages. So they allocated their share of the river by those percentages, with Colorado getting a little over 50%. Well, there's a lot more to that law of the river, and I'll touch on it a little bit as we go, but really there's a few key points to make here. One is this system is overallocated. There is no doubt it's overallocated from what we know of today in terms of what the system is going to likely to produce year to year. It's overallocated. Not overdeveloped yet because the upper basin states do not use their full 7.5 million acre foot apportionment. The hydrology is highly variable. It changes a lot year to year, and storage capacity is critical on this system, and I'll drive that point home more than once. And I also want to leave you with the thought the system is operated on a tight margin, particularly down here in the lower basin. We're at full development of our apportionments. Conservation, wise water use is a key to our existence. Okay, let's show you a chart. I'll try to define the axes. These are millions of acre feet. This is time, essentially the last century, 1914 up to 2007. There's 2 graphs. One is supply and one is water use, and I'll bet you can tell me which is which. No? Clearly. Notice in the supply how variable it is year to year, as we mentioned. Notice also in the period of the 20s when the compact was signed, we thought there was more water in the system than what we've seen over time. Now again, highly variable. The period of the 80s, these are the biggest flows ever on record. Hoover Dam spillways flowed for 3 straight years. That's the only time those spillways have flowed. So a couple things to point out here. Obviously, we know demand has been growing year to year, and this is really use. So demands could be higher in any given years. This is our measurement of what was actually used. What do I mean by that is in the upper part of the basin, there are not enough storage capacity. There isn't enough above some of the uses. So irrigated agriculture often is shorted in a dry year because there's just no water in storage to match it up. So this is used. Notice that particularly in the last 25, 30 years, there's been many years where use outstripped the supply of that year. Well, how does that work? Why could that work? Storage. We all know that. I think of this often as your checking book. This is your checkbook year to year, and your savings account is the water and storage. And honestly, that's why we have so much storage on the system. People learned this early on. This is not anything new, and we spent a lot of years developing the amount of storage we have. Notice in 1977, that imbalance between use and the supply that year is on the order of 4 million acre feet. So we had a 4 million acre foot deficit, and we got through it. And we got through it because we had water we stored in previous years. We often say here in the lower basin particularly, we live on the high flow years. And we'll make that point here again in just a minute. Okay, so what did we do as the federal government? We built a storage system. And I'll just touch base. I'm not going to even read all the names. In the upper basin, these are the primary storage reservoirs on the main stream and its tributaries. Together, they can store over 30 million acre feet of water. The bulk of that water storage capacity is in Glen Canyon Dam, Lake Powell. Over 80% of that total capacity is in that one reservoir. You'll note in a bigger map that Glen Canyon is just on the other side of the Lee Ferry boundary. That was by design. Lee Ferry is, again, the compact point. There's an obligation of the upper basin to not deplete the flows, as we've talked about, and water stored in Glen Canyon Dam in Lake Powell is what the upper basin can use to make sure they meet the delivery obligation to the lower basin. And that is a very important piece of the complexity of this system. If we move to the lower basin, here are the three big facilities in the lower basin. Again, Hoover Dam's the bulk of the storage, and again, these reservoirs can store over 30 million acre feet of water. Note, I didn't put the reservoirs on the Gila River Basin up here. And again, we know why, because essentially at this point the Gila is used. Only in very high flow years does water come out of the Gila River Basin and hit the mainstream, and used by, of course, the state of Arizona. Okay, so let's look at another graph that will look a little complicated at first, but let me walk you through it. This axis now is the percent full of the lake, either Lake Powell or Lake Mead, and they're pretty close to the same amount of storage. For purposes tonight, let's call it 25 million acre feet. Each reservoir can store 25 million acre feet in it. So 50% full is that line right there. The blue line is Lake Mead, the red line is Lake Powell, and let's walk left to right over history, starting in the early 30s when Hoover Dam was built, and it filled rather rapidly. Lake Mead filled within the first 10 years. And why? There was no storage above Lake Mead. This was the first dam on the system. We were trying to control those highly variable flows. People had begun irrigating in Yuma, Arizona in the early part of the century, early 1900s. Flooding, often on the Gila River Basin, flooding wiped them out. I think most of you know the current Salton Sea is really there today because a flood channeled by a diversion in the early 1900s. It was more than one flood, in fact, 5 as I recall, and the river changed course. Now the river had been changing course historically many, many times, and the Salton Sea had been there many, many times and then dried up. But that is really what created the current Salton Sea. And then it was maintained, of course, by agricultural runoff as we built up that area. In any event, as you walk across, you see in the period of the 50s, look at the drought that hit in the 50s. And again, we don't have much storage above us, so Lake Mead takes the brunt of that drought. As Lake Powell comes online, notice Lake Mead has to take a dive because now you're trying to fill a new large reservoir. This is the really start of what we call coordinated operation of Lake Powell and Lake Mead. And if you recall, that's one of the things that I want us to discuss a little bit tonight, is how those two big reservoirs are operated, because they are so vitally important to all of us. We needed to fill Lake Powell. We needed to continue to meet delivery obligations in the lower basin and generate hydropower, because as we all know, hydropower really was paying the bills, right? That's how we paid back most all of these large reservoirs to the Treasury, is through hydropower revenues. We had a filling criteria. This was a negotiated 7-state agreement, essentially, led by the feds again, to how we were going to fill Lake Powell while meeting our obligations in the lower basin through Hoover Dam. Called the filling criteria. They had a period or a specified time that they would evaporate. And Lake Powell had to get above a certain elevation, and Lake Mead had to be above a certain elevation concurrently. And that happened in June of 1980. So it took the bulk of 20 years to fill Lake Powell while still meeting obligations in the lower basin. Back in the 70s, a law was passed that directed the Secretary of the Interior to come up with operating criteria once the filling criteria were over. We did that. I wasn't here at the time, but in any event, it was the long-range operating criteria, it's called. And those criteria were put in place in 1970, but didn't really start being used until the 80s, till we had filled Lake Powell. We operated under those criteria through till the mid part of the last decade, through 2005. Those were the operating criteria we used to coordinate the operation between Lake Powell and Lake Mead. And what happened was the drought of the 2000s hit. And when it did, you can see the red line and the blue line are falling fast. And particularly when it got real bad, 2002 was one of the 3 worst years in the 100-year record. Lake Powell dropped even faster than Lake Mead. So there was a lot of consternation throughout the basin that our operating criteria didn't work well enough. Quite frankly, if you look at those graphs, we didn't have a lot of experience operating these reservoirs when they were low, right? We had filled one after already having the other one, and then we had the big flows of the 80s, as we mentioned. So we had a lot of experience operating them when they were high, but not a lot of experience when they were low. Our 2 modes of operation back then for Lake Powell were fairly simple. Each year we would release 8.23 million acre-feet of water. You could, in your mind quickly, this is not codified, it's not the way the agreement got struck, but if you added that up, if you remember, there was 7.5 million acre-feet of water each 10-year period. Divide by 10, that's 7.5. Mexico gets 1.5. Divide that by 2. That's essentially 8.23. That's a way to get to the number of what we released each year. The little .02 is a credit from the Paria River, which is a drainage that comes in just above Lee Ferry. In any event, we had that mode release 8.23 million acre-feet of water every year out of Lake Powell, unless some other mode kicked in, and it was called equalization. And what that said is we will equalize the lakes if they're high enough, and particularly if Lake Powell has enough water in it to ensure the upper basin they can continue to develop while meeting their requirement for 75 million acre-feet over every 10-year period. That's another bone of contention. What does that mean? Enough water to allow you to develop your full apportionment in the upper basin while meeting your delivery obligation. How much water is that? Well, we could probably all sit down with a pencil and paper and come up with, however many of us there are, 50 or so in the room, different ways of doing that. And so it's another one of those pieces of the law of the river we've agreed to set aside, at least for a period of time. And we did that in these guidelines. Okay. We talked about how we operate in the lower basin on a tight margin. Let me give you a quick checking book example at Lake Mead. So if we're releasing 8.23 million acre-feet of water every year from Lake Powell, there's roughly about another 750,000 acre-feet of side inflow out of the Virgin. and other drainages throughout the Grand Canyon into Lake Mead, you'd get about 9 million acre-feet of water into Lake Mead. Our outflow is we're producing delivering 7.5 million acre-feet to the 3 states, plus 1.5 million acre-feet to Mexico, and about another 600,000 acre-feet, more or less, to overcome losses for evaporation and other downstream regulation, as we call it. So that's 9.6 million coming out of the lake. Mead itself loses about 600,000 acre-feet a year in evaporative loss just off of Mead itself. The balance is minus 1.2 million acre-feet. If we all had a checkbook and this is how we did it every month, we wouldn't like it, would we? And so, again, how does it work? High flows. Again, back to our comment that here in the lower basin, we typically really are living on the high flow years. High flow years, we fill up the lakes, we balance them or equalize them better, and it builds Lake Mead back up, and we're off and running again. And the big question for the future is, what about high flows? Will they continue to come? Will they come at the same frequency? Will they come at the same magnitude? Will it be more or less? Frankly, we don't know, but we're trying our best to at least look at the likelihoods of all of those outcomes. Okay, these guidelines, what do they really do? They tell us how to operate these 2 lakes. We now specify that operation throughout the full range of operation, low to high reservoirs for both Lake Powell and Lake Mead. Let me point this out to you. It's an annual operation. What it says is this is how much water we will release each year, depending on where the lakes are. It doesn't say anything about how we do it monthly, daily, hourly for hydropower, any of those other issues. It's just setting it for the year through our annual operating plan, as we call it. We implemented, as part of the low Lake Mead reservoir strategy, shortages to the lower basin. There's never been a shortage yet to any of the users in the lower basin from those basic apportionments. Now, not throughout that whole time, as we noticed, not everyone took all their water, and the state of California, quite frankly, legally used unused Arizona's water for a number of years throughout the 70s and 80s. But there's never been a shortage on the river system in those basic apportionments. There's not a river system in the world that can make that claim, in my opinion and in my knowledge. This is very unique, but it was very clear that with continued development that wouldn't always be the case, so we implemented shortage strategies. State of California is not a part of that under these guidelines. By virtue of part of that law of the river, your water right is 4.4 million is senior to the Central Arizona Project's water right in the state of Arizona. So the shortage agreement is between Arizona and Nevada. And our guidelines tell us when to implement those shortages. It starts at elevation 1075. We'll talk just a minute about where Lake Mead is today. The other thing it did was establish a mechanism to promote water transfers even further down here in the lower basin. As we mentioned earlier, Michael and Hala will talk to you about a little later, we operate under this prior appropriation doctrine in the West. What that means is first in time, first in right. Who got here first? Irrigated agriculture. That was how the system was really set up back in the early 1900s. So primarily the senior water rights are held by irrigated agriculture. Cities came later. Cities typically have been a lower priority. Free movement of water or movement of water through the more rigid priority system is important to flexibility of managing this system. This mechanism is called intentionally created surplus. That's an odd name. It's an odd name because it fits within the guideline or the law of the river. That's why it's called that. I won't bore you with any more than that with it. But it encourages flexible water use. Here's an example I'll give you here in just a second. Before I do that, let me hit on 2 other pieces on these guidelines. They're good for an interim period. We put them in through 2026. We're often asked, why not longer? I think the simplest answer is we all realize there's so much uncertainty. This is about all we know. Let's go for a 20-year period. Let's see how they work. We'll gain valuable experience and knowledge. And then when we sit down in 2020, which the guidelines say we must start no later than December 31st, 2020, to figure out what we're going to do post-2026. We should know more, and hopefully we can make even better decisions. They also don't include anything for Mexico. This is a domestic agreement in the U.S. The Secretary of the Interior's authority ends at the border, and so this agreement doesn't include Mexico. We are working with Mexico in a completely different forum, trying to find some cooperative measures to better manage the system with respect to their allotment as well. Okay. ICS. So one of the things I failed to say on the last slide was that these kind of deals are really a combined effort. Over hundreds of people throughout this basin, hard work is in this deal. And particularly this idea of ICS. This was really due to the lower basin states. They came up with the idea. And so this is an example of a reservoir we built along the All-American Canal. And what it does is it captures excess flows. When flows arrive at the border of Mexico and they're over Mexico's schedule, we, the U.S., don't get credit for it. They are excessed to Mexico. This reservoir was funded by the three entities in the Lower Basin Metropolitan Water District, Central Arizona Project, and Southern Nevada Water Authority. They put up $170 million. We built the reservoir, we reclamation, and in exchange, they get a piece of the water that's conserved. And this is what the ICS mechanism is about. It's not a free market system by any means, but it brings more market forces to be allowed to facilitate or work within water transfers. Okay. Here's where we are today. Let me just not bore you with too much detail here, but where we are at Lake Mead is at 1,124 feet of surface elevation above mean sea level. The lowest it got in the 50s when I showed you that graph was 1082. The first shortage is at 1075. Back in November of 2010, Lake Mead got to 1082. The lowest it had been since it had first filled. 7 feet above the first shortage, there was lots of concern throughout the basin. And last water year was 140% of average. Lake Mead gained 50 feet in 1 year. Not at the expense of Lake Powell either. Lake Powell gained. The point of that story really is the variability on this system and high flows. That's the key again, and the question always is, how will they look in the future? So we're still 62% full basin-wide. This is the forecast for this year. The key number, you probably don't care about all the individual drainages, is Lake Powell. That's the number we care about. What this is what's the forecasted inflow April through July from the spring runoff of the snowpack, and it's 46% of average. Quite a difference from last year. The good news is we got lots of water in storage right now, or at least a good amount of water in storage. Here is a good graph, I think, if you don't mind one more graph. This is how much water is on the ground in snow. And here's its measurement in terms of inches. That's not so important. Here's its time starting in last October through this water year. Several graphs. The blue line is average. So what you'd see is the snowpack builds up, the snowpack runs off. And again, this is how wet the snow is as well, not just the depth of the snow. Here's last year. Nice year, 140% of average. Here's this year, the green line. Not so nice year. A couple of key things to point out here. Look at what happened last year. Look at this bump in December. The point of this is it's a few good storms because 80% of the runoff comes from 15% of the watershed. You just need a few good storms in the right place. The problem is none of us know how to get them there. It's really Mother Nature, isn't it? But isn't that remarkable? So again, last year, look how they all track in the early part because you not got the snow yet. And once the snow comes, you can see a few good storms is what makes it for us all. All right, let me skip that slide, and we've talked about it. Let me talk a little bit about the future and take a question or two here. What are we showing here? Remember that graph of the supply and the use? Now all we've done is smooth it. We put a 10-year average on it so your eye can smooth it out a little better. And clearly, we see a potential problem there. If supply stays down and demand continues to grow, the imbalance gets bigger and bigger. And that's really what our concern is about. What about out here over the next 50 or so years? We're doing a study and we're trying to look at what could happen in those 50 years, both in terms of the demand and the supply. Highly uncertain. We're doing it through scenario planning. If you've ever had experience with that, what that means is you postulate with lots of stakeholder input what the possible, plausible scenarios for the future are, both in terms of demand, growth of cities, efficient use of that water within the cities, growth of agriculture, efficient use of that water, etc. So lots of scenarios. We have developed 6 on the demand side. The supply side, again, scenario-based. We've looked at climate models. That's the newest thing for us that we've been looking at, because you read a lot in the papers about what the climate models are telling us would likely happen on this river system. Our modeling that we don't do, we pick it up from universities and other researchers, including NOAA, we do the analysis, show us that roughly over a 50-year period, a 10% decline in the average annual runoff in the system is likely. Now, there's a lot of uncertainty in that. The question again really is in terms of what should we all do about it, we on this system. So this study is looking at that. I encourage you, if you've not heard about it, I'll leave some business cards up here with this email and link address, web address for you. It's been going on for a couple of years. The 7 basin states are our partners. HALA is involved in this, as others. What are we really trying to do is we're trying to assess those future plausible futures of supply and demand, figure out what those imbalances in supply and demand might be, and probably more importantly, start the discussion about what we should do about it. Since we won't know what the future is, we're likely going to take a phased approach, right? We might develop portfolios of ideas, some in the near term, mid-term, long-term. Many times people talk about what you want to do in the near term is develop no regrets policies. Put things in place that no matter what the hydrology does in 10 years, you look back and you don't have any regret that you did it. So there's a lot of that analysis going on. What I would like to really conclude with is point out this is a planning study only. There are no decisions to be made in this study. What the goal of the study is to develop a sound technical foundation we can all hang our hats on to facilitate the discussion now and in the future about what we ought to do to ensure the sustainability of this system. With that, I'll close. I appreciate your attention, and